This is my submission for the English Literature History final exam. Welcome to my presentation, and I hope you will like what I have done and created for my submission. So, first of all, um, in this first slide, I am going to introduce what era and the author that I am going to be um, analyzing and use to make make my presentation. So the era that I chose is the Victorian era, and the particular author is Charles Dickens. So let's move on to the first chapter. The first chapter, that is the introduction. Victorian literature refers to English literature during the reign of Queen Victoria, 1937 to 1901. The 19th century is widely considered to be the golden age of English literature, especially for British novels. It was in the Victorian era that the novel became the leading literary genre in English. English writing from this era reflects the major transformations in most aspects of English life, from scientific, economic, and technological advances to changes in class structures and the role of religion in society. Famous novelists from this period include Charles Dickens, William Thackeray, the three Bronte sisters, George Eliot, and Thomas Hardy. While the Romantic period was a time of abstract expression and inward focus, essayists, poets, and novelists during the Victorian era began to reflect on realities of the day, including the dangers of factory work, the plight of the lower class, and the treatment of women and children. Prominent examples include poet Elizabeth Barrett Browning and novelist Charles Dickens and Thomas Hardy. Barrett's works on child labor cemented her success in a male-dominated world where women writers often had to use masculine pseudonyms. Dickens employed humor and an approachable tone while addressing social problems such as wealth disparity. Hardy used his novels to question religion and social structures. Poetry and theater were also present during the Victorian era. Robert Browning and Alfred Tennyson were Victorian England's most famous poets. With regard to the theatre, it was not until the last decades of the 19th century that any significant works were produced. Notable playwrights of the time include Gilbert and Sullivan, George Bernard Shaw, and Oscar Wilde. Moving on to the next chapter, that is the biography of the author. Charles Dickens is much loved for his great contribution to classic English literature. He was the quintessential Victorian author. His epic stories, vivid characters, and exhaustive depiction of contemporary life are unforgettable. His own story is one of rags to riches. He was born in Portsmouth on the 7th of February 1812 to John and Elizabeth Dickens. The good fortune of being sent to school at the age of 9 was short-lived, because his father, inspiration for the character of Mr. Micawber in David Copperfield, was in prison for bad debt. The entire family, apart from Charles, were sent to Marshalsea along with their patriarch. Charles was sent to work in Warren's blacking factory and endured appalling conditions as well as loneliness and despair. After 3 years, he was returned to school, but the experience was never forgotten and became fictionalized in two of his better-known novels, David Copperfield and Great Expectations. Like many others, he began his literary career as a journalist. His own father became a reporter, and Charles began with the journals The Mirror of Parliament and The True Sun. Then in 1833 he became parliamentary journalist for the Morning Chronicle. With new contacts in the press, he was able to publish a series of sketches under the pseudonym Boss. In April 1836 he married Catherine Hogarth, daughter of George Hogarth, who edited sketches by Boss. Within the same month came the publication of the highly successful Picwick papers, and from that point on there was no looking back for Dickens. As well as a huge list of novels, he published autobiography, edited weekly periodicals, including household words and all year round, wrote travel books, and administered charitable organizations. He was also a theater enthusiast, wrote plays and performed before Queen Victoria in 1851. His energy was inexhaustible, and he spent much time abroad. For example, lecturing against slavery in the United States and touring Italy with companions Augustus Egg and Wilkie Collins, contemporary writer who inspired Dickens' final unfinished novel, The Mystery of Edinburgh. He was estranged from his wife in 1858 after the birth of their 10 children, but maintained relations with his mistress, the actress Ellen Ternan. He died of a stroke in 1870. He is buried at Westminster Abbey. Moving on to the next chapter, that is the works. The first works featured is the Pickwick Papers. The Picwick Papers is a sequence of loosely related adventures written for serialization in a periodical. The action is given as occurring in 1827 to 1828, though critics have noted some seeming anachronisms. For example, Dickens satirized the case of George Norton suing Lord Melbourne in 1836. The novel protagonist Samuel Pickwick, Esquire, is a kind and wealthy old gentleman, the founder and perpetual president of the Pickwick Club. He suggests that he and 3 other Pickwickians should make journeys to places remote from London, and reports on their findings to the other members of the club. Their travels throughout the English countryside by coach provide the chief subject matter of the novel. A romantic misunderstanding with his landlady, the widow Mrs. Buttrell, results in one of the most famous legal cases in English literature, Bardell versus Pickwick, leading to them both being incarcerated in the Fleet Prison for death. Pickwick learns that the only way he can relieve the suffering of Mrs. Bardell is by paying her costs and action against himself, thus at the same time releasing himself from the prison. The Little Dorit. Little Dorit is a serial novel by Charles Dickens. The book witnesses the shortcomings of the society and the government of the period and is a work of satire. Rigaud is in Marcellus jail, serving sentence because of committing a murder. The novel also mentions another character, Arthur Clenham, who stayed with his father in China for 20 years and now is going to visit his mother in London. His father gave him a watch when he died, saying that Arthur should give it to his mother when he meets her. Inside the watch there are words where the word "do not forget" is inscribed, which means that Arthur and his mother should not forget that his father loved both of them dearly. William Dorrit is imprisoned in the jails of London, and his 3 children, Fanny, Edward, and Amy, or Little Dorit, grow up in the jail. They are free to go outside the jail when they please and come back again. Amy is dedicated in the services to her father. She even supports the family financially through her sewing. When Arthur comes to London, he visits his mother and is acquainted again with his former fiancée and lover, Flora Finching. Arthur's mom is paralyzed and has to use a wheelchair. Still, she manages her family business with the help of her servant. She also provides employment to Little Dorit, and Arthur now thinks that Little Dorit must be connected to the mysterious watch in one way or the other. Little Dorit falls in love with Arthur, but Arthur does not accept her love. Later, Little Dorit obtains a huge fortune, and her father, Mr. Dorit, is now free from the prison. They, now being rich, decided to tour the whole of Europe and also visits the Alps and Rome. However, fate works in a mysterious way. Both Mr. Dorit and his brother die in Rome, and Little Dorit now returns to London and now stays with her sister Fanny and her husband, Mrs. Clenham. Is sorry for her behavior with Little Dorit and asks forgiveness. Being a kind-hearted girl, Little Dorit give her forgiveness. Mrs. Clenham is glad to know that Little Dorit has secured such a large fortune. Arthur is also now a rich man. He also now feels love for Little Dorit because of her kind nature. He becomes a gentleman and proposes marriage to Little Dorit. Little Dorit is happy because she also loves Arthur from the core of her heart. But he was the one who initially refused to marry her. Arthur even asked for Annie's forgiveness. Mrs. Clenham is delighted to know that his son is marrying such a wonderful girl. Arthur and Little Dorit get married towards the end of the novel and stay happily ever after. Moving on to the next chapter, that is the selected work. And the selected work that I chose is the Pickwick paper. So there are 7 intrinsic elements of a short story as follows: A. Theme, B. Characters, C. Setting, D. Point of view, E. Plot, F. Conflict, G. Resolution. First, the theme. The Pickwick Papers, Charles Dickens' first novel, began as a simple comedy. As it grew in popularity, however, he took the opportunity to make strong statements about the flaws he saw in society and the obligation of people to address those problems. Law and politics. Many of society problems, as Dickens saw it, revolve around law and politics. He had worked in a law office as a youth and was a journalist covering Parliament for years. As a result of these experiences, he grew suspicious, even contemptuous of lawyers and politicians. In the Pickwick Papers, lawyers and politicians are, for the most part, watching out for themselves rather than serving the suffering of the poor. Every Dickens novel addresses the suffering of the poor in some way. Dickens was greatly affected by his father's imprisonment for debt. In the Pickwick Papers, Dickens complained about a system that allows people to be ensnared and to suffer in a system they could never escape. Marriage and love. Much of the novel focuses on love and marriage, which do not always, in a society, go together. Dickens seemed to argue that marital problems occur when people marry for societal reasons, such as money or respect. But when people marry for love, happiness, and the factors. Mr. Pickwick. Mr. Pickwick is an elderly man and the founder of the Pickwick Club. He is fond of food and drink and collecting interesting facts and stories on his travels. The novel follows his adventures as he travels throughout England. He spends time with his closest friend and is frequently accompanied by his servant, Sam Weller. Mr. Pickwick is admired as a humanitarian and a scholar, but he seems to be very naive and easily fooled. He has several embarrassing experiences, but the most challenging is when his landlady accuses him of breach of promise, landing him in prison. Mr. Pickwick survives his time in prison and is ultimately vindicated. Sam Weller. When Mr. Pickwick first meets Sam, Sam is a servant at an inn. Mr. Pickwick is impressed with Sam's ready wit and offers him a job as his servant. Sam accepts the job because Mr. Pickwick offers a good salary and a set of nice clothes. As time goes on, Sam becomes deeply attached to Mr. Pickwick. He even arranges to get himself arrested so that he can care for Mr. Pickwick in prison. Sam refuses to get married when he believes his marriage will prevent him from serving Mr. Pickwick. Mr. Pickwick eventually arranges things so that Sam can both work for him and marry the girl he loves. Mr. Jingle. Mr. Pickwick and his friends meet Mr. Jingle at the beginning of their adventures. Mr. Jingle is described as very tall and thin, with a distinctive way of speaking. While Mr. Pickwick and his friends enjoy Mr. Jingle's company, he frequently causes problems. Mr. Jingle is on the lookout for what he can get, as when he persuades Miss Rachel Wardle to run away with him so he can get her money, Mr. Pickwick loses track of Mr. Jingle, but finds him again in prison. Mr. Jingle and Job, his friend and servant, have been imprisoned. Mr. Pickwick is good to Mr. Jingle, which seems to change Mr. Jingle's heart. He is genuinely grateful to Mr. Pickwick and seems determined to be an honest man in the future. Job brother. When the Pickwickians first meet Mr. Jingle, Job is not with him. Sam meets Job later when Job tricks him and Mr. Pickwick. Job's trick embarrasses Mr. Pickwick and allows Job and Mr. Jingle to escape. Job's relationship to Mr. Jingle seems to be as much friend and accomplice as servant. Nevertheless, they are inseparable. Job even stays with Mr. Jingle when Jingle is imprisoned for debt. Near the end of the book, Mr. Pickwick arranges for Mr. Jingle to travel to the West Indies. Job is offered a position in London, but chooses to travel with Mr. Jingle. Mr. Winkle. Mr. Winkle dresses, talks, and acts like a sportsman, but every time he is given a chance to demonstrate his prowess, he fails miserably. He is terrified when he thinks he will have to duel, falls off a horse, accidentally shoots Mr. Tupman, and can't manage to escape. In spite of all that, he is able to woo and win Arabella Allen, and they elope. Then they need Mr. Pickwick's assistance to persuade Arabella's brother and Mr. Winkle's father to approve of the marriage. Mr. Tupman. Mr. Tupman is described in an aromantic way. He is a chubby little man who takes himself more seriously than the rest of the world does. In spite of this, he does have one great romance in the book. He woos and almost wins Miss Rachel Wardle. After Rachel elopes with Mr. Jingle, Mr. Tupman is greatly disappointed. He never again pursues a serious relationship with a woman, indulging in self-flirtation to satisfy the romance in his soul. Mr. Snodgrass. Mr. Snodgrass is a member of the Pickwickian foursome at the start of the book. He manages to avoid the embarrassing entanglements of his friend. However, he falls in love with Emily Wardle and they pursue a secret relationship. Eventually, the relationship is made public and Mr. Wardle is persuaded to allow them to marry. Setting: the first ray of light which illumines the gloom and converts into a dazzling brilliancy that obscured. The highlighted sentence denotes the time, that is the dawn of sunrise. Morning. Pickwick Papers is set in southern England in the years of 1827 to 1831. Among other things, this novel gave an enduring literary expression to the coaching days period of English life. As Dickens was writing his novel, that period was rapidly being destroyed by the new railroads. An air of nostalgia seems to hang about the coaches, coachmen, macadam roads, and wayside inns that fill the book. Dickens, in fact, played a large part in creating the romance of the coach through his treatment of it in this novel. Point of view: The Pickwick Papers is told by a third-person omniscient narrator. However, some sections of the book feature first-person accounts of different character stories. The plot: The Pickwick Papers began at a meeting of the Pickwick Club, where the members are honoring the founder, Samuel Pickwick. Mr. Pickwick intends to travel around the country, gathering stories and doing research. He will be accompanied by his three close friends, Mr. Tupman, Mr. Snodgrass, and Mr. Winkle. The Pickwickians meet Mr. Jingle, a supposed actor and conman. At their first stop, Mr. Jingle insults a local doctor, and the doctor proposes a duel. Because of a mistaken identity, however, Mr. Jingle receives the challenge, not Mr. Jingle. Fortunately, the angry doctor realizes Mr. Winkle is not the man who insulted him, and the duel is averted. The Pickwickians are invited to stay with Mr. Waddle at Manor Farm. While there, Mr. Snodgrass develops an attachment to one of Waddle's daughters. Emily and Mr. Tupman begins to woo Mr. Waddle's sister, Miss Rachel Wardle. At a cricket match, the Pickwickians encounter Mr. Jingle again, and Mr. Waddle invites him to visit Manor Farm. Mr. Jingle manages to break up Mr. Tupman's romance with Miss Wardle and persuades Miss Wardle to ally with him instead. Mr. Pickwick and Mr. Waddle to catch up with them at an inn where Mr. Waddle pays off Mr. Jingle, who then leaves. Also at the inn, Mr. Pickwick meets Sam Weller, who works there and who greatly impresses him. Conflict. Back at home in London, Mr. Pickwick speaks to his landlady, Mrs. Bardell, about his desire to hire Sam as a servant. Mrs. Bardell believes that Mr. Pickwick is proposing to her and faints in his arms. Mr. Pickwick's friends arrive to find him holding her, a very awkward situation. The Pickwickians visit Eatanswill during election time. At a party, Mr. Pickwick once again encounters Mr. Jingle, who is now using an alias. Mr. Jingle flees, but Mr. Pickwick and Sam follow. Sam meets Job Trotter, Mr. Jingle's servant, who tell them he will help them stop Mr. Jingle, but it is a trick. Instead, Mr. Pickwick is caught in an embarrassing situation, and Mr. Jingle and Job escape. Mr. Pickwick receives a letter from two lawyers, Dodson and Fogg, informing him that Mrs. Bardell has sued him for breach of promise because he has not married her. Mr. Pickwick returns to London and tries unsuccessfully to reason with Dodson and Fogg. On his way to meet his own lawyer, Mr. Pickwick and Sam bump into Sam's father, a coachman who complains bitterly about his second wife, Sam's stepmother. Mr. Weller also claims to know where to find Mr. Jingle and Job Trotter. Due to a misunderstanding, the Pickwickians and Sam are arrested and brought before the magistrate. Luckily, Sam has learned that Mr. Jingle is staying at the magistrate's house under an assumed name. Mr. Pickwick informs the magistrate, gets himself into trouble, and prevents Mr. Jingle from accomplishing his next scheme. At the same time, Sam has a pleasant meeting with a pretty young housemaid, Mary, who works for the magistrate. Um, the next one is resolution. In the prison, they find Mr. Jingle and Job Brother both weak and ill. Mr. Pickwick helps them so they can begin to recover. Mr. Pickwick insists he will stay in jail indefinitely, but Dawson and Fogg arrest Mrs. Bardell on the ground that she owes them their fee. She is sent to the same prison as Mr. Pickwick. Mr. Pickwick knows if he pays his fees, she will also be released, so he does so, arranging the release of himself, Sam, Mrs. Bardell, and Mr. Jingle and Job. Mr. Pickwick learns that while he was in prison, Mr. Winkle and Arabella Allen alone. They ask his help in breaking the news to Arabella's brother and to Mr. Winkle's father. Mr. Pickwick does his best, although neither family is initially pleased with the marriage, they both come to accept it. Mr. Pickwick learns that Mr. Snodgrass and Emily Wardle are also in love. Mr. Wardle is reluctant to approve the match, but eventually he does, and there's another wedding at Manor Farm. Mr. Pickwick announces he is done with traveling and plans to dismantle the Pickwick Club. He buys a house and lives there with Sam, watching over his friends and their new family. Mr. Pickwick realizes that Sam is in love with Mary, who now works for the new Mr. and Mrs. Winkle, and he arranges to hire Mary as his housekeeper so that Sam and Mary can be wed. Moving on to the next chapter, the conclusion. The Victorian era is a tumultuous and an ever-changing period in English literature history. It's at this time that novel became a popular medium of entertainment for all the classes. It's also a time where there are changes to technological advancements, social, religion, and political aspects in society. Novels from this era are also more focused on realities rather than the fantastical non-fiction literatures of the past. Charles Dickens wrote, "Nature gives to every time and season some beauties of its own, and from morning to night, as from the cradle to the grave, it is but a succession of changes, so gentle and easy that we can scarcely mark their progress." Dickens' writings showed the social injustice that existed in England during the Victorian era. His novels were full of characters from all different walks of life that present the people of England with a mirror of what they were acting like. The reality of nature, as Dickens said, is that we all pass through life just like morning and night, and from the cradle to the grave. No living person is exempt from that fate, regardless of social status. That is all from my presentation and my submission for the English Literature History final exam. Thank you for listening, and I hope you have a great day.